Hi, I'm David Crow, and this is episode 248 of The Infectious Myth. Email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. That's Crow with an E. Join the discussion and like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at infectiousmyth. Listen Tuesdays at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on prn.fm, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or other programs. You can listen to any of the last 5 episodes over the phone by dialing the U.S. number 701-719-0990 and following the instructions. PRN.FM has voicemail. Call 862-800-6805. And as well as a message or question for the show, leave your name and indicate it's for The Infectious Myth. If you dial either of these numbers, long-distance charges may apply. I don't know that you're a listener until I hear from you. Send me a message letting me know how you stay in touch with the show and what you like about it. If you include your mailing address, I'll send you a little thank you gift, one of the bookmarks I make by hand using my own photographs. I do really love to hear from my listeners. Don't be shy. I'm spending a lot of time on the show these days, especially with writing articles on the coronavirus and doing all the research that's necessary. So consider donating. You can make a one-time donation to the expenses of the show via PayPal using the email david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com, or you can commit to monthly donations at patreon.com or liberapay.com, where we are also Infectious Myth, one word. We appreciate all our listeners, but if you want the show to continue to grow and improve, consider paying a small amount for the information you're gleaning, for the support you get for some non-mainstream ideas, the challenges you get to others. If you'd like me to speak at a meeting of an organization you're a member of on any topic on which you think I have an interesting and worthwhile opinion, I'd be happy to discuss this with you. I appreciate you commenting and suggesting guests. I appreciate your financial support as well. Thanks for listening and for recommending this show to your friends. I've had a tremendous amount of feedback on my article and podcasts on the coronavirus, and unfortunately I don't have time to read all of it today, but I will get to it. Thank you to everyone who's considering the information I'm bringing forwards. That's what I really want. And please feel free to send links to my coronavirus podcasts and my article, infectiousmyth.com/books/coronaviruspanic.pdf, with a capital C and a capital P on coronavirus panic, to anyone who might be interested. Briefly, some of the comments are: wonderful article, wow, thank you so much for your work, well-researched article, excellent breakdown of the coronavirus, you're one of the few sane voices, and a criticism, you read too fast for us foreigners. I'll try to work on that. I'm sad to report that Tony Bark, who was interviewed in episode 27 in September of 2014 on the CDC vaccine scandal, has died of cancer. Rest in peace, Tony. I'd like to thank Eric for the donation via PayPal. Eric wrote with his gift, "Thanks for the myth busting." Jenn Smith is returning to the show. He is a transgender-identifying male with degrees in history and political science, born in Oliver, British Columbia, Canada. He's coming back to inform us about a case in his province of British Columbia in which a hospital informed a father that they don't require parental consent for testosterone injections, and it's been getting worse and worse over time. Jenn Smith and another journalist, at least one other, are deeply involved in the case. In fact, they're on the firing line of the judge. Jenn blogs at transanityca.wordpress.com. Welcome back to the show, Jenn.
It's good to be back on the show. Actually, it's easier for people to get to my website by going to jennsmith.ca.
Oh, okay. Jenn Smith, and it's Jenn with 2 N's, right?
Yes, and in one word, Jenn Smith. Yeah.
I'll put that in the show notes. The nice about something written is slightly more complicated spellings can be handled more easily.
Yeah.
So let's start, before we get into the case, let's talk about the publication bans involving, the father, yourself. Like, what is it that we're not allowed to, well, I don't know if I'm covered because I'm not in British Columbia, but what is it that you and the father and a couple other people are not allowed to talk about?
Okay, so yeah, there is some sort of, like some people are unclear about some of the details of this case. For those who don't know, this case basically came to my attention back in 2018 and I was the first person to talk to the father and interview the father. And I wrote about this for the Post Millennial nationally in December of 2018. And at that time, there were no court orders in place at all.
Right.
The first court orders that were ordered in regard to this case, and I should say there is statute law in BC. So there are laws regarding family cases and minors that are automatic. So you can't talk about minors in the press.
I mean, you could talk about them, but you can't use their name, right?
Yeah, you can't name them. That's
Right.
what I mean. So there is that statute law in place that covers minors. However, when you're talking about adults, that requires specific orders. Now, the first order in this case was in February of 2019. So that was basically 3 months after the case had come to my attention. And that order,
I think I interviewed you in January of 2019, so just before this order came down, I guess.
Yeah, probably. I don't remember when I did that interview with you, but if you say so, I'll assume that's correct.
Okay.
So yeah, late February of 2019, an order was put in place, basically prohibiting naming the father in the case in any publication. In April 15th of 2019, a second order was put in place prohibiting naming any of the healthcare professionals who were involved in the case. So there was basically a blanket prohibition on naming any of these individuals in connection with the case. Okay, so this is where there's a misconception. I can talk about the case. Anybody can talk about the case, but you're not allowed to name names within the case, right? And also, if you want to talk about the doctors, so one of the doctors who we're going to christen Dr. Chan. Okay, if you want to talk about Dr. Chan, you can talk about Dr. Chan and all the stuff that Dr. Chan is doing and criticize Dr. Chan all you like. You're just not allowed to connect Dr. Chan to this case. You can't connect the two items, right?
Yes.
And that applies to all of the healthcare professionals. So the exception here is that the father, you can't talk about the father at all, as far as I'm aware, in terms of anything to do with gender transition. But with the healthcare professionals, it's just connecting them to this case.
So basically, my understanding is that this involves a father divorced. I mean, these cases almost always involve a divorce, because otherwise the parents presumably would likely be on the same side, who had a biological daughter who decided that she was really a boy. The father objected. The mother kind of went along. It doesn't sound, from what I know, that she was enthusiastic one way or the other, but she kind of let it go. Mm-hmm. And the hospital got involved and said, well, even though you're the father and you have equal responsibility or equal rights regarding your daughter's healthcare decisions, we're going to take that away from you. And there's some laws in BC that I guess allow them to do that in extreme cases.
Well, actually, no, extreme cases is not really accurate. So the situation in British Columbia, actually, it's quite similar in most provinces in Canada, and most people are probably unaware of this. But in BC, there is an act called the Infants Act. The Infants Act in BC was passed back in the 1990s by an NDP government at that time. Actually, it was in place before that, but they made some major revisions to it in the 90s. And the Infants Act essentially was designed initially to enable minors, if they wanted to get, for instance, vaccinations and their parents were opposed to it. So they implemented this act saying that if a doctor did an assessment of a minor and came to the conclusion that they were aware of the potential health risks and aware of the consequences, or basically the pluses and minuses of any particular procedure, as long as they were aware that they were able under law to give them status as what they called mature minors, right? And they were able to consent to having these procedures done against parental wishes. Now, initially that was designed to apply to things like say, vaccinations, treatments for STDs, and even highly controversial, but abortions, right? Stuff like this.
Yeah, and I think in the past there's also been cases involving blood transfusions, because there's religions that refuse blood transfusions, and sometimes there's dissension within the family about whether it should be allowed or not.
Yes, and this has been tested in court under that provision about the blood transfusions too. There was a case, I believe, with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Right.
But so yeah, there is this law in place that enables basically any I believe the wording is non-life-threatening conditions. So any condition that a minor might seek. And this is where it's because that wasn't really clear when the legislation was put in place. The legislation doesn't even set an age limit. So it doesn't say, you have to be over 12 or something. It just says, well, they would call them infants, but infants basically is anybody under the age of 19. So it's it doesn't set a lower limit. It's just up to the doctor in question.
And this is different than, there are cases where a doctor will go against the wishes of the parents and the child, say in the case of blood transfusions, and the doctors will force something on a minor child. But this is different legislation, because it's basically saying we're going to elevate the child essentially to an adult, right? And if you're an adult, you can make your own decisions. And of course, the doctors do. This implies that the doctors agree, because the doctors wouldn't do it if they didn't.
Right.
So basically, the doctors plus a minor child can override both parents if they want to.
Right. Okay. So this is the thing. Now, it should be stated that the reason that I got involved in this case in the first place was, first of all, because of my activism. I'm a fairly well-known activist on this topic in British Columbia, so my name's sort of out there. But also, about 6 months before this case came out, I had stumbled across a document published by the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority. It was a peer-reviewed document that was designed to guide physicians in the Lower Mainland in terms of how to treat transgender youths, and what are the best policies and procedures in that regard. Within that document, I was surprised to see a reference to the Infants Act, and that these doctors were recommending that the Infants Act should be used to treat transgender youths, and that sex reassignment should fall under the category of procedures that a youth can get against the wishes of parents. Now, when I saw this in that document, I was quite alarmed, and so I announced this and provided screenshots of the document on my social media platforms, and said to everybody, "Look, this doesn't look very good. It looks like they're going to trample parental rights and sort of allow minors to get sex reassignment against parental wishes." Now, at that time, the other side of this debate came at me and said, "Oh, you're just a fearmonger, and they're just saying that for a worst case scenario, and they would never do something like that."
Right.
And at that time, I didn't have any evidence to sort of come back at them with to refute their refutation.
And what date was this approximately?
That was in I believe that was in June or July of 2018. So because I didn't have any evidence, like I knew there was this case in Prince George. There was a case in Prince George where a father was forced to facilitate his child's gender transition using Lupron, I believe it was in that case. But I was unaware at that time that the Infants Act was involved in that. I didn't get access to the court documents on that until later. So I didn't have any evidence. Fast forward ahead to December of 2018, and I was contacted by Angelina Ireland, who at that time was seeking the candidacy for the Conservative Party of Canada. And she knew me, so she had heard about this case, and she said, "Well, I heard about this father who's being forced to facilitate his daughter's gender transition. You should really check this out." And when I heard of the general details of it, having talked about the dangers of this 6 months before, And having warned people that there were bad things coming down the pipe here, I immediately recognized that, okay, this is a big case. I need to get on this immediately. So I scrambled. I interviewed the father. I got all the details. I took a look at the letter that had been issued by the Children's Hospital to him. And I subsequently published this in the Post-Millennial. But the letter that the Children's Hospital sent to him at that time basically said that because he opposed the testosterone injections, is what they wanted to give her. Basically, and just to give a little background, there were 3 steps along the way. So the child basically was first consulted by counselors at the school, and from the counselors at the school, she was referred via the mother to a psychologist, a Dr. Chan that we're talking about, who is a leading gender psychologist in British Columbia. So she went to this Dr. Chan. She saw him, I don't know, a half dozen times, and then he determined that she was suitable for testosterone treatments to fully change gender, right? So he referred...
Well, fully might be a slight exaggeration. To gain some secondary male characteristics.
Well, what they would call fully, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you can never change sex, period.
Yes.
No, you can severely alter your body, though. So he referred her to the BC Children's Hospital, and the father actually was at that stage kind of reluctantly going along with the whole thing. He's like, okay, we'll see what happens. We'll see what the doctors say. And he was doing his own research at that time. So when she was referred to the BC Children's Hospital, he thought, well, okay, this is just the most recent step. They're going to do a bunch of assessments, and they won't do anything extreme until they've seen her at least a few times, right? But on the very first visit to the BC Children's Hospital, within 2 hours of being at the Children's Hospital, he received a phone call from his ex-wife saying they want to start giving her testosterone shots right now. And the father was like, whoa, hey, wait a second, this is way too fast. No way, don't do that. Bring her back home. So that's what happened. And she was brought back home. And then after that, he sort of solidified his position and said, listen, this is an extreme procedure that's going to totally alter her body and possibly sterilize her for the rest of her life. I'm not going to consent to this. Like, just forget it. This is something she should do as an adult. And the social
and how old
worker,
was she at the time?
when she first went to the BC Children's Hospital, she was 13.
13. Oh
13, yeah. And by the time that, because eventually they would order these procedures to go ahead, when the procedures finally started, she was 14. But shortly after the father made it clear that he wasn't going to consent, he was contacted by it was the social workers at the BC Children's Hospital who tried to, communicate with him and get him to understand that, in their opinion, this was the best thing to do for his daughter. But he wouldn't have any part of that. So the next step was this letter that was sent from the I guess the legal department of the BC Children's Hospital, and the main endocrinologist there, who basically said that, look, your daughter has been assessed by the hospital. We've determined that she is fully aware of all of the pros and cons of this procedure and is capable of making the decision to begin testosterone injections. Therefore, this decision is not your decision to make. Furthermore, it is not your wife's decision to make. The decision rests solely with the child, and we're going to begin these testosterone injections whether you like it or not.
So they carved out the mother as well.
Nothing you can do about it.
They carved out the mother.
Yeah, well, they made it clear in the letter. So the mother at that stage was sort of reluctantly agreeing to allow the testosterone injections, but the letter said that even though she's agreeing, it wouldn't matter what she said.
Just in case she changes her mind, we just want to make it clear that your mind doesn't matter. Whatever you think is
that's
irrelevant.
Right. Yeah, the decisions of the parents are completely irrelevant. So that was basically when that that letter had just come to him when I first connected with him. So I got photocopies of the letter, and screenshots of that were published in the Post Millennial. I also at that same time published it on my blog. And here's an interesting thing. Currently, I am prohibited from referring to my own work done at that time. The court has said that I cannot tell you the name of the article that I published on my blog. I cannot refer you to that article. I cannot publish another article referring you to that article, because that article names the doctors in question, right? So they gave me some, the lawyers for the other side, we'll get into that in a second, all the lawyers involved in this.
So they can't take down that article, but they can make sure you don't refer to it anymore.
This was the debate. So initially, when I was contacted by the legal team, they were intending to have that article taken down. By the time I showed up in court, the lawyers approached me outside the courtroom and said, listen, we've decided we're not going to try to get that article taken down. And I think that's because I had immediately gone online and said, look, and they're retroactively flushing things down the memory hole here. This is Orwellian. So I think because I know they were, at that point, they were watching everything I was doing on social media, right? So I think they changed their minds at that point and said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to let that article continue to exist there, but we're going to prohibit you from referring to it or linking to it.
Right.
So,
well, I'm sure my listeners couldn't possibly figure out where it is, so you don't need to worry.
Yeah, it's too difficult in any case, so I can't refer you to that. But
yes,
in that article at that time, I published all of the names, and the article that was published with Post Millennial, which actually I don't think is on their website anymore. They may have pulled it down for their own reasons. I don't know, but all of the names went out there. When it was published in Post Millennial, it got tens of thousands of views. It was shared 8,000 times, widely circulated at that time, right? So the names and the stuff were out there, and people who follow this closely, most people who follow this closely know the names of the doctors, and a lot of people know the name of the father in question too. So what happened most recently was the father being frustrated with the way things were going, and the fact that he had been sort of disempowered as a parent.
Well,
and,
can we just take a
sure.
little time to say exactly how he was disempowered? Because you kind of referred to him having things beyond not being able to refer to his daughter by name. Like, what are the restrictions, what has the court said you cannot do in terms of talking about the case to him?
Yeah, well, there are some good things to sort of point out there in terms of the Orwellian nature of
it's very Orwellian, which is why I want you to go through it carefully, because it's pretty stunning.
Sure. Okay, well, the main things, we'll start with the least controversial first. The main things is that he's not to identify himself in terms of this case in public at all. Initially, there was a ban on him trying to convince his daughter to consider other options, right? That was eventually lifted, and he's allowed to have conversations with his daughter. But he was prohibited from talking with the public or identifying himself. He was not allowed to do media interviews or anything like that. He was also, and this is where it really gets Orwellian, he was ordered by the first judge on the case, which was Justice Bowden, to only refer to his daughter using male identifiers, male pronouns, to refer to her as a son, not as a daughter, and to make no references to her using her biological sex whatsoever. So he was forced basically to refer to her as something that she wasn't. And that's
so if a judge says from now on 2 + 2 = 5 for you, not for other people, but for you, 2 + 2 = 5, then if you're teaching math to your kids, you have to tell them that 2 + 2 = 5. Well, you don't believe it.
This was one of the issues that I brought up when I was dragged into court, because when they dragged me into court for potentially actually I did violate the court order
Good for you.
slightly. But once they dragged me into court, I was basically, I said to the judge that, because the judge was sort of looking at all of these violations, because the legal team on the other side brought in not only my violations and the violations of Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson, who was also dragged into court for an interview that she did with the father, but there were all of these other violations. Like they said that it was getting out of control. So many people were violating the court orders, and he's looking at all of these violations. And I said, the thing here, your lordship, is that why do you think this is going on? Okay, why do you think that you have so many, in many cases, you've got Christians, people who are otherwise law-abiding and otherwise have a great respect for law and order in the courts. Why do you think so many of these people are violating the law? The reason is because the court has lost favor with the public. The public no longer believes in the integrity of the court. So I said that what has happened with the court, and I would suggest that the Bowden ruling should be set aside in its entirety because it set a bad tone. Because the court in this case, by forcing a citizen to speak lies, has untethered itself from truth and at the same time untethered itself from justice, become nothing more than the arbitrary enforcer of what is essentially a Orwellian totalitarian state. And until the court addresses this issue of forcing citizens to speak lies, the court has fallen into disrepute, and you're going to lose the respect of the community at large. So this needs to be addressed. Because as you say...
And what was the judge's reaction to that?
Well, that's sort of an interesting thing. So as you kind of pointed out there, though, if you can force a citizen to say, a girl is a boy or a man is a woman, that's a precedent. That is a dangerous precedent. So what's next? They're going to force people to say war is peace. So if we go bomb some country somewhere and I say, well, that's an act of war, the courts are going to come to me and say, no, that's an act of peace. And don't you dare say otherwise, right? It's a precedent. It's a dangerous precedent. Now, when I pointed all of this out, and I said that to the judge too, I used the Orwell stuff. I said, what next? War is peace, ignorance is strength, slavery is freedom. And the judge just sort of looked at me and kind of made some notes, and he never really quite addressed that. And all the way through, like I went to court 4 times on this issue, including 2 full days in court. And at no point did the judge ever address that issue.
So are you just involved because you talked about this? That's how you got dragged into this. You interviewed, you wrote about it, and therefore the judge thinks you violated some order, and therefore they can drag you into court and beat you up about it.
Well, I'll tell you what my theory is. I mean, I don't know the thinking processes of the other side here, but again, basically what happened was because the father felt so disempowered and that he wasn't allowed to talk to anybody about this, he wanted to talk to the world and try to rally support behind his cause. And he also wanted to alert the community of, the dangers of what was happening. But he was under court order not to do that. So at some point he became frustrated at his lack of power, and he said, okay, I'm going to start doing interviews anyway. So he started doing that. He did an interview with, I believe, the Federalist in the United States, and then he did an interview with Frank Vaughan, a video interview, and Frank Vaughan, I think, is Ontario. And then he did an interview with Laura Lynn Tyler Thompson, who's in BC, who's a sort of TV evangelist, or former TV evangelist. And when I saw that he was doing all of these interviews, because I knew him, right, and I had been the first one to talk about him, and because I am an activist in BC on this issue, I said, okay, well, if he's going to be doing interviews, he should do an interview with me. So I contacted him and said, so since you're doing interviews, why don't you do an interview with me? Because I am sort of the preeminent activist in BC trying to prevent child transitioning. So I think it's important, if you're talking to people, that you should talk to me, because I think I can thresh this subject out more fully than anybody. So he agreed to do that. So I announced that on my Facebook. I said, okay, I'm going to be doing an interview with the father, and I named him because his name was out there already. It was floating around all over social media. So I said, I'm going to be doing an interview with him on, I forget what night it was. It was like a Thursday night or something. And within probably within 12 hours of my making that announcement, I started getting email, what they call email services. I didn't even know before this case that you could be served by email now under special orders from the court. So the first service that I got from one lawyer, I was like, I'm being served by email. Is that even legal? So there was some question about where this, the legitimacy of the service I was getting. But then over the next few hours, I started getting more and more and more. I started getting all of these services from all these different lawyers saying that I was in violation of the court order, and they were seeking something called short leave. Basically, what that is they put aside the normal processes and time periods to bring something into court, and they get it expedited. So what happened was that I essentially ended up in court within 12 hours of getting my first service. So it was a very quick thing. So I think what happened.
Did you do the interview?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So the court, I was ordered to appear in court the day that the interview was scheduled. So the interview was scheduled to take place at, I believe it was 7 p.m. that day. And it was almost as if they were worried about me doing an interview with the father because of my status as a prominent activist in BC on this subject. I think they were very concerned about the father and I getting together on this in such a public way.
Right.
So they intervened and dragged us into court on short leave the day of the interview. And the judge, the Supreme Court judge at that time, Justice Tamman, basically ordered that the interview not proceed literally 2 hours before the interview was scheduled to take place.
Well, it's nice to know that the justice system can work fast when there's something so critically important.
Yes. Yeah, it was very sort of overwhelming for me that it happened so quickly. And then the other sort of one of the amusing things is like I was not represented by a lawyer. I went in there myself to defend myself. And then so there's me, and then at the first date there was the father, and there was Laurel and Tyler Thompson. None of us had lawyers. And the other side of the table was this team of lawyers and legal assistants, right? This mob on the other side, right? So that was kind of interesting, and it expanded in time too, as we got into, I forget, it was either the second court date or the third court date. The Attorney General of BC injected himself into the discussion and announced, filed an application as an intervener, and announced to the judge that they were concerned that what was happening in this case with the violations of the court orders constituted a threat to the rule of law in BC. And thus they had an interest in this case. And the judge initially said that he didn't know whether he was going to grant them that intervener status. But he said that they were welcome to stay in the courtroom, I guess. And so the Attorney General stayed there until our last court appearance, when the judge basically referred the whole issue to the Attorney General's office for review.
This brings up another issue, the asymmetry in a lot of these cases. I mean, the firepower on the other side is overwhelming, and that means a lot in the judicial system. I mean, it's not like in every case where there's 100 lawyers on one side and no lawyers on the other side that they're going to win, but it sure puts a pretty heavy weight on the scale in favor of the people who can afford endless lawyers and consultants and whatever else is needed to ensure that the opposition gets crushed.
Yes, and that was my experience. So this was a very sort of eye-opening experience for me, because I haven't been in court in like 40 years. When I was a troubled youth was the last time I was in court. So this was a real sort of experience for me. The thing is that again, they've got like a team, like high-priced lawyers with unlimited resources, all kinds of assistants and stuff. So for them, it's a bit of a snap. They can slap all this stuff together in a relative hurry. They came in with binders, huge, thick binders of screenshots of everything we were doing on the internet and stuff, right? So they've got all of these resources. For me, it was overwhelming, because I didn't realize initially, like I decided that I was going to fight this to a certain extent and sort of oppose their motions. And what I should say is that after the second day in court, the judge issued a ruling saying that he was basically reaffirming the publication bans and was clarifying them to make them even, so there was no misconceptions about what it meant, because there was a debate as to whether or not the publication bans applied to chatter on social media. So he clarified that and said, no discussion on social media whatsoever. But at the time that they issued this clarification, they also stated in there that there would be no oral publication. And that affected me specifically because I do public talks, right? And very shortly after I met the father, I incorporated this story into my public talks to kind of connect all the dots about what's going on with transgender ideology in British Columbia. So when I saw that they had put in the orally thing, I said, okay, your lordship, I've got a problem with this because this is going to affect my ability to do what I'm doing as a public policy advocate. And you kind of earlier described me as a journalist. A journalist was a thing that I kind of did on the side. The primary thing I am in BC is a political public policy activist. That's what I do. I'm a political actor. I'm trying to affect policy change in British Columbia. I'm calling for provincial and national inquiries into what's going on. So I told the judge that this is going to significantly affect me. And furthermore, you're not really addressing the timeline here and the fact that I had published all of this and I came to all of this information before any court orders were in place. And the existing court orders talk about the proceedings of what is going on in this court case. Well, everything I know about this court case didn't come from the proceedings, right? It came from my knowledge and interactions with the father ahead of time. So what the judge said at that time was that, okay, I tell you what, I'm going to temporarily put this order in place with the understanding that we are going to reconvene in court on March 9th. And at that day, we're going to reserve the whole day. And I'm going to give you an opportunity at that time to present your case as to why you think the publication bans on specifically or particularly the doctors should be lifted in any other applications that you might have. So it was all moved over to March 9th. Now,
which has come and gone.
Which has come and gone. Now, to that point, I hadn't done any paperwork. I just went into the court and sort of responded to the applications against me, but I didn't really have to do much of anything. Once we got to going to the March 9th date, okay, now I need to do applications and stuff. And this is where the paperwork started. So I was unaware that there's like a ton of paperwork that you got to do. You got to fill out this big long application, which has all these sections, and you got to know sort of legal precedents and all of this stuff. So there was a huge sort of learning curve that I had to deal with initially in dealing with this application.
If you had 100 lawyers on your side, it would all be done for you.
Exactly. So, but the thing is that I don't have a lawyer. Plus, I also work 40 hours a week, right? And this is all a very tight time window that this took place in about a week there. So I had to learn how to do the application. I had to drive from Abbotsford to downtown Vancouver, which is a long drive in rush hour traffic, right? Back and forth, filing papers. I had to go to the courthouse there and get some help from the legal society and stuff. And I had to swear affidavits. And the affidavits for me being transgender was even more difficult because like 2/3 of the transgender population, the name that I use socially, which is Jenn, is not my legal name. I never changed my identification, and most transgender people don't. But that initially created a problem because when I was served and came into the court, I was served under the name Jenn Smith, but that's not my legal name. But now I need to do paperwork where I'm filing an affidavit that you have to swear at the courthouse, right? And
I mean, could you have argued back then that you were served under the wrong name?
I could have, but there would be no point because I figured like Jenn Smith, that is me, like a horse by any other name, right? It's still me. So I didn't want to contest that. Plus, that's the name I prefer to use. So, but when it came to the process of swearing an affidavit, it was a problem because I was listed on this sealed case. So the text of the proceedings there is sealed under court order, right? And I'm listed in there as Jenn Smith, but now I've been given an opportunity to do an application and I have to swear the affidavit, but you can only swear an affidavit using your ID.
Your legal name, yeah.
your legal name and stuff. So when I went in to swear this affidavit, this caused a problem, and everybody at the office there, suddenly there's a big conference meeting about how to deal with this problem, right? And whether or not I could even file the affidavit. Eventually it was worked out and it went ahead. But just to sort of give you an idea of all the problems I was going through. Plus, you got to get all of these, anything that you're submitting, that I was submitting, had to be done, because by that time there were like, I think 7 different lawyers involved, right? So I had to make copies for everybody. So the paperwork in terms of photocopying and all of this stuff all had to be done too. And all within this 1 week period. Furthermore, I had to, in that same time, construct what I thought would be a convincing argument to bring to the court, which on its own would have been enough to use up all my time, right?
Yeah.
So over this period of a week there, I ended up getting an average of about maybe about 3 hours sleep a night. There were a couple of nights where I only got 2 hours sleep. I was so desperately trying to get everything together to do my presentation to the court. But that gives you an idea of what the average person, someone like me, is going to encounter when they are besieged by a high-powered legal team on an issue like this. Most people just wouldn't be able to deal with that at all, right? I was barely able to deal with it, giving every moment of my time, but I did manage to pull it off. And I came in and I gave out what I thought was a very convincing presentation. The courtroom, by the way, on March 9th was packed full of people.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, there were a lot of people there. And so I brought my A game, because I'm a public talker, like a public speaker. Right. So this is what I do. This is my strength, right? So I put together what I thought was a powerful presentation to argue why I should be excluded from the publication ban, or why the publication ban, particularly as it refers to the healthcare professionals, should be lifted completely.
Yeah, I want to ask you about why the doctors are protected in this way.
Right. So I gave this big presentation, and what happened after that was it actually extended another day. So I thought we were going to spend all day March 9th on this, and then we'd be done and it'd all be over. But we went all day March 9th, and then it got carried over, and we spent all day March 10th on this too. So by the time we got done March 10th, the judge basically said that he listened to my presentation carefully and my arguments, and he thought that my arguments had merit. However, he was not prepared to lift the publication bans on the doctors. But what he was prepared to do, he kind of threw me a crumb. He said what he was prepared to do was he was going to let me talk about the doctors and their connection to this case, but only in my public talks, and only in that, these small rooms, right? Nothing outside of that room. Furthermore, anybody who attended my talk had to be informed about the publication bans and prohibited from recording, and that if anybody recorded the content of my talks and posted it to the internet, I would be responsible for that. So I would have to police that and be responsible for that legally. So it was almost like setting me up for failure, because I've had this happen before where opponents of mine, I don't let people record my public talks because I like to control the dissemination of my information. Right. So I have put out copyright statements on my public talks up to this point. And even though I do that, people have violated my copyright statements.
In this day and age, people take photos when they're told not to take photos. People record things when I've been guilty of doing that. Right.
Right. Well, but in my case,
right?
Yeah, I know. I understand people will be, in some cases, recording me and stuff, even though I'm telling them not to. The point where people kind of cross the line is when they publish it to the internet, right? Because now you're actually really violating my copyright. But even though I make all of these statements, and even though I pursued some of the people who've done this, I couldn't stop it. Like, there's people who put recordings of my talks out there, and they're still online, and I can't do anything about it. Actually, the one that I had the biggest trouble with actually just recently pulled it down because she was anticipating that I was going to be criminally charged, and she didn't want my defamatory information on the web, because that was her argument. But anyway, that just sort of shows you that I can't control what people are doing in my talk. So they were setting me up for failure. But the thing is that, okay, so he throws me this crumb, and I thought, okay, well, at least it's something, right? But immediately after throwing me this crumb in his order, lawyers for the Provincial Health Authority and Dr. Chan stood up and said, okay, we have a motion here to stay the order. So they had come in fully prepared. They had all of their documents filed. They had a binder full of authorities to cite, and they were asking for the order to be stayed. And the judge granted that order. So they gave me something for a moment and snatched it away. And they said they were taking it to the Court of Appeal to appeal the decision. So that's
So,
where,
okay, so now you got me totally confused. By staying the order is no longer in effect.
the order has been written. Okay, so the judge has written the order,
Right.
but it is not in force. So it's just there pending a Court of Appeal hearing.
So now you can talk about these things, but at the Court of Appeal, they may hit you with something even more.
No, I cannot talk about these things. The pre-existing orders are still in place. The new order, which gave me the authority to talk about these things.
Okay. Oh, that's the order they stayed. Okay, that's my confusion.
Yeah, no, they stayed that order, the order that gave me the ability to talk. So that one.
Okay, they're going to appeal that slight little crumb.
Right, so that's going to the Court of Appeal. I got quite upset about that actually after the fact, because this whole ordeal, like 2 weeks of being sleep deprived and nearly killing myself to have to fight this team of lawyers and stuff. But by the time I was done at the end of Tuesday on March 10th, I was emotionally and physically spent. And at that point, I went on. I did an interview with YouTube broadcast called Freedom Free for All. In that interview, I said, I'm not going to keep doing this. Okay, I'm not going to let these legal vultures drain the life out of me. Okay, I'm just going to go out there and I'm going to speak the truth. Okay, and if they want to drag me into court in chains, they can do that. That's the only way I'm going back into court, is in handcuffs. And I'm just going to keep on speaking the truth. So I was very upset, and I sort of said, I'm done. But now that I'm a little better rested and stuff, I've had all kinds of people coming to me saying, listen, you need to pursue this at the Court of Appeal. You can't just let it go.
Yeah.
So
we've been talking a long time, and I want to know, what were the arguments for protecting the identity of the doctors? And can you talk about what kind of involvement the doctors have in transgender issues outside of this case?
Okay, yeah, this is all very important. So it links into what I do as a public activist. So in many ways, I'm a whistleblower, right? So what I do is I connect dots, and I show the relationships between different people, and I show that there's essentially a systemic thing going on with this whole transgender thing. And in order to do that effectively, I have to name names and connect dots. Mm-hmm. So the publication ban on the doctors was justified on two grounds. The first one was to call it specious would be generous. Basically, they said that by identifying the healthcare professionals involved in this case, you might somehow identify the teenager in question.
Like, they might have like 200 patients, and that helps you figure out which one it is.
Well, this one, the Dr. Chan that we're talking about here, has 1,000 patients. So, the odds of that happening are slim to none. Right. So that one is like whatever, right? The real one that they have, the real justification, is that when this story was talked about and published in the Federalist in the United States, in the comments underneath the article, there were all these people who made all kinds of nasty comments and stuff. And you can imagine some guy in Alabama in his underwear reading the story and going on to the comment section and going, yeah, these dumb doctors, somebody ought to string these doctors up, something like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna drive up there with my AR-15 and blow them away.
Right, exactly. So the kind of stuff that you see on the internet, the kind of stuff that I get, like as a public activist myself, I've gotten all kinds of threats of physical violence against me, and death threats and stuff like that. But it's real easy. People get real brave on the internet when they feel there's no consequences. Mm-hmm. So they clip these online threats and stuff and said, well, you see, these doctors are under imminent threat. They're in serious danger. So we need to protect them from, these crazy people in Alabama who are going to get in their pickup truck and come down and, do a number on them or whatever. So that was the justification there. It was to protect the safety of these doctors. The thing is that the Dr. Chan that we're talking about here is a very public figure. Okay, so he is out there all the time doing interviews, television interviews. He writes books. He is constantly talking about public policies and stuff. So he's not shy from public policy or from publicity. It's only when something that he does or advocates has terrible consequences, right, and destroys a family, that suddenly he doesn't want any publicity. right? And this is another interesting thing. So you talk about how these doctors are involved. So the two primary doctors that I focused on in this case are both public policy activists. They've both written papers, they've both attended conferences, and they've both made suggestions in terms of policy. So the document that I talked about where I first identified the Infants Act and the power to do sexual reassignment on minors, that was done by the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority, but Dr. Chan was part of that document. He helped, he reviewed the document, and he was an advisor for the document. So he is involved, at the policy level in British Columbia. He also worked with the government for a period, and now he's put in the policies that are actually feeding patients to him that he's making money off of, right?
I think somebody said that he was heavily involved with foster children.
Okay, well, this is another thing. So this is where I really got, like, I've always been sort of concerned about the effect of this whole transgender thing is having on particularly psychologically vulnerable kids, kids with autism and these types of things who are identifying as transgender at startlingly high rates, right? So I was always sort of concerned about that. But when Dr. Chan came to my attention, he did a talk in February, I believe it was, of 2019, and he revealed at that time that of his 1,000 patients in British Columbia, half of them were from the Ministry of Child and Family Development.
So he's sucking money out of the government because presumably all their costs for counseling or whatever are covered by the government.
Yeah. So, but the thing is that is we don't know the demographics of who are these children? Are they all foster children? Are they all, are some coming from other departments of the child and family development? We don't know. If we were to presume that they're all foster kids or kids otherwise under the care of the government, that represents 7.7% of all children in the care of the government in British Columbia. 7.7%, right? Compared to, it's 0.5% of kids in the regular population who identify as transgender. 0.5%. 7.7% of all kids in the government's care, if these numbers are correct, and if they're the sort of break down that way, would be in the care of one doctor, just one doctor. And being myself, I was a foster child. I went through 6 different homes, right? And I know what it is to be a wounded, psychologically traumatized child looking for a new identity, right? So when I learned that
I mean, at the best, you have feelings of abandonment. As a foster child, right? Like it's very hard, even if you've got the best foster parents in the world, you still have this feeling, my parents abandoned me. They didn't love me, right? Like you're always going to be vulnerable.
Yes, an enormous sense of rejection and an enormous sense of, being out of place in the world, right?
Yes.
Just naturally. In my case, I was also viciously bullied in schools. Right?
Yeah, I mean that happens to children who aren't foster parents, but foster children, but it's worse. You may be in a foster home where you've got other children who are not your siblings who are going to bully you worse than if you were.
Yeah, well, it's a combination. So when you get a combination of being rejected by, or the internal perception yourself of being rejected by your family or rejected by the world, plus you're getting bullied at school, so you're being rejected again, all this rejection, can of do a real psychological number on you. And that's when I sort of, I was very young. I started experimenting with transgender identity at that time too, out of this sense of rejection, right? So when I learned that this Dr. Chan had so many kids in his care that were, probably foster kids, I became even more alarmed, and it became a very personal, emotional issue for me that I'm pursuing, with aggression.
We're running out of time. I would just like to give you an opportunity to complete any thoughts that are incomplete, bring up something really important that we didn't get to before we end this discussion.
Right. So the other thing, the final thing that we should note is that with this Dr. Chan, for instance, he actually writes books, and these books are have become part of the SOGI 123 curriculum in British Columbia. So he's actually putting materials into the school system that are affecting the minds of these young kids. So he's involved at every level. And I sort of, what I try to do is I try to connect all these dots. And this case with the father and his daughter shows all of the problems and all of the potential bad consequences of all these policies and all the different players out there. And it shows, for instance, that the girl in question began identifying as transgender after seeing a film in school that was part of the SOGI 123 program. And I'm, of course, opposed to SOGI 123 because I believe it's brainwashing kids.
Yeah,
and so this case really brings it all together for me. And this is why I've argued to the court saying, I need to be able to connect all of these dots and discuss everything, because this is my worst case scenario, and it's the only case of its kind that I have. And if you take it away from me, you're disempowering me as a public activist.
Well, in a few years, there's going to be a great courtroom drama created about this, and everybody's going to emphasize with the abused children. Of course, sadly, by the time we get to the point where opinion has become sane again, a public opinion has sort of got on side with sanity. God knows how many children are going to have try to start changing sex, and in many cases reject it after they've permanently altered themselves chemically, or with mastectomies, or with hysterectomies, removing their ovaries, whatever. Mm-hmm. Children will, get to their 20s and go, now I would like to have a child and I can't.
Yeah, there are permanent consequences to sterilization. It should be noted that the surgeries in most cases can't take place until 18, but that's still very young.
Yeah, and I think there's a big argument that if you get children on this road, you get them on the hormones, they very rarely change their mind until it's too late. But if they go to a psychologist and they're told nothing's going to happen until you're an adult. If you want hormones, you have to wait. Then generally by that time, they're starting to question whether they need to change their sex or whether maybe they're gay or something like that.
It's social transition is the big thing, actually, that makes the biggest difference. So if you've got kids who are identifying as, we'll say, gender dysphoric and identifying as the opposite gender, if you allow them to socially transition and sort of facilitate these inclinations, somewhere between 65 and 90% of these kids will go on to stay transgender and identify as transgender into adulthood. Whereas if you intervene at that point where they're identifying as the opposite gender and don't facilitate that and don't let them socially transition, the vast majority will not go on to be transgender. So it all has to do with whether or not you affirm their identity.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining me again today, Jan, and good luck with all the court proceedings, and I'm hopeful that sanity will eventually prevail.
Yeah, we all are, and thanks for having me.
Okay, it was great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to episode 248 of The Infectious Myth. If you have a comment, a question, or suggestion for a future guest, please email me at david.crow@theinfectiousmyth.com. Like us at facebook.com/theinfectiousmyth. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram @InfectiousMyth. Commit to monthly donations of any amount to Infectious Myth, one word, on patreon.com or liberapay.com. Until next week, thank you and goodbye.